Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all, this time covering El Cid, The Life and Afterlife of a Medieval Mercenary by Nora Berend. So, this is a nonfiction book from this year, which is, I would say it's unusual for me to read super recently published things, but I have been doing a little more of that. In the past year or two, so that's fun. Um, anyway, El Cid. So Rodrigo Diaz, El Cid Campeador. It was a Spanish knight. Basically, it's kind of a complicated. In the 11th century, Spain was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and the Muslim kingdoms in the south. And this is right around the beginning of the period that is called the Reconquista, although there's some stuff in the book about kind of differing opinions on the concept of Reconquista and the way that a lot of historians have sort of pointed out that it wasn't like a kind of single continuous project the way that that designation makes it sound, and that therefore maybe instead of describing it as like the broad Reconquista period, to talk more specifically about what was happening at any given time and what was going on between the various forces in Spain. This book is about El Cid, but it is not kind of just about El Cid's life. As the title suggests, a significant portion of the book is about El Cid and his sort of role in culture after he died. So the first, I don't know, 60 pages or so. Book's not super long. My digital copy was like 300 pages total, but only, like 240 of that is the sort of main text, and there's lots of notes and sources and stuff at the end. And all of that is probably worth reading if you are interested in delving deeper in the subject. And at some point, I may do that, but probably not right now. I'm really not an expert in medieval Spain, so I'm not as concerned with a lot of that sort of stuff. Anyway, the first 60 pages or so after the introduction are about the period of El Cid's life. First, there's a sort of broad overview of Spain from the time of the Muslim conquests and the establishment of Al Andalus as basically the southern half or two-thirds, or maybe more, of what is the territory of modern day Spain, and then leading into the kind of specific situation that Spain was in the time of El Cid's life, and some of the kind of back and forth, some of the political issues that were going on. In particular, one of the big things that goes on is the fragmentation of a lot of Al Andalus into these smaller Muslim kingdoms that are fairly rich, but not as able to fight effectively, I guess, is basically the kind of summary. This kind of political fragmentation and then gradual political recoherence. But in that time, this is a period where a lot of the Christian kingdoms in the north, excuse me, are making fairly significant gains into the territories of the Muslim South, or are extracting tribute from them, or things like that. And so it's kind of a complicated back and forth between these sort of two sides at the very kind of highest level of historical overview. The argument is that that's sort of what's going on, although obviously at the kind of level of an individual person's life, it's a lot more complicated than that. And El Cid is a complicated person. Rodrigo Diaz is the name of the man who comes to be called El Cid, which comes from the Arabic word Said, which is Lord. So El Cid being sort of like the Lord, but it's kind of an odd nickname, I guess. He's also called Campeador, which basically means something like War Master or Warlord. So El Cid Campeador is a legendary warlord and knight from this period. His real life is not completely impossible to parse out, but much of what the book is about what happens to this kind of historical biography of a real person as it is transformed into um, kind of hagiography, right? That he's transformed into both this kind of um, incredible, magnificent, superhuman knight and also a virtuous saint and all these other different kind of things going on um, as the way that his particular story is reinterpreted and repurposed for the issues of whatever kind of contemporary period that is happening in. So El Cid himself was a complicated man. He was definitely a really talented warrior, won a lot of battles, was exiled from his kingdom multiple times, ended up fighting as a mercenary for basically both sides of the Reconquista, ended up eventually essentially taking over one of these small petty kingdoms, for lack of a better term, in Al Andalus, the Taifa of Valencia, which at the time was basically largely surrounded by other other Muslim states, all these small kind of petty kingdoms. And after Rodrigo's death, was reconquered. He was originally buried at Valencia, but his body was moved by his wife back north into Castile, into the region where he was born and grew up. And that becomes sort of a big deal later on because the places that are associated with the Cid become part of his legend. And obviously, all of these different places end up, um, some of them have real historical claims to something of the Cid. There are like actual documents that he signed that are like donations to monasteries and things like that. But then there are also places that come to be associated with the legend and especially with these legendary events that never happened. One of the stories is that El Cid's king was the for most of his life was the brother of basically there were two brothers, both kings, who each inherit a different kingdom from their father. And El Cid originally was the vassal of the older brother, who is killed by a double agent, essentially a knight who supposedly pretends to be a traitor from the younger brother's court, and then gets the king alone and kills him. And so the younger brother ends up taking over both kingdoms and consolidating power. And there is this fabricated legend of the vassals of the court basically saying, "Okay, we require want to require some type of oath to prove that the new king did not essentially did not plan to kill his brother, that this was an isolated incident and not a piece of intrigue, because obviously it's bad to kill family members and to kill kings and all that sort of stuff." And supposedly none of the members of the court are brave enough to demand this oath until Rodrigo Diaz says, "All right, I'll be the one to demand this oath." And he accepts the king's oath. but this is what poisons the king's opinion against his brave and loyal champion. And so this is part of why El Cid is later on exiled, is because the king is opposed to this man who, as a vassal, kind of stood up to royal prerogative. The issue with this is that this doesn't seem to have any relevance to what actually happened in the earlier sources. And that the earlier sources suggest a number of different kind of oath-taking moments, but they are all not at all like this. They are largely Rodrigo El Cid offering or taking oaths to prove his loyalty so that he can come back from exile. And so that this is a kind of invented folk tale of a historical event that didn't happen, but that there is a real church that is believed to be the site where this event took place, and that it eventually becomes a cultural marker. Obviously, it's good for that particular kind of small town that was originally outside of Burgos, and then I think is now basically a suburb, is what the book says. Um, Good for that particular church, and also becomes like really symbolic for a lot of later Spanish people of this kind of, for lack of a better term, Republican spirit of the inherent kind of dignity of man and the equality between a ruler and a citizen. This idea that El Cid is um, able to administer this oath to his king as a demonstration of kind of parliamentary checks and balances, and this idea that the citizen has a real kind of right to demands upon the ruler, just as much as the ruler has a right to demands upon the individual citizen. And so this is a big deal for the kind of later expectations of like Spain in the 18th and 19th and eventually 20th centuries as to kind of what it means to wrestle with this tumultuous period of history. But it is built on an event that doesn't seem to have historical basis as ever happening. It is legend, basically. And that's what a lot of the later part of the book is about. The last kind of 2/3 or so of the book, most of it ends up being about these legends of El Cid, and the way that there are all of these kind of different events that are attributed to his life or the lives of people around him. In particular, his daughters make up a important portion of the mythology later on, and the way that their husbands treat them, and this kind of idea of the sort of role of women and kind of the sort of idealized expectations of the role of women as presented in these fantastical texts versus a sort of more historical expectation of the role of women based on what limited amounts we know happened in the actual 11th century, as well as these kind of larger than life daring do's and these imagined adventures, and in particular, the transformation of El Cid from essentially a very talented mercenary. He's a very, very capable warrior, but he is basically a warrior who, when he is exiled, is willing to fight for almost whoever until eventually fighting for himself. Um, and that this is very different from this idea of El Cid as this kind of saintly figure, as this figure who is kind of emblematic of the Reconquista in particular, this kind of knightly crusading warrior who is kind of modeled after this imagined version of like the knightly holy orders, this idea kind of like the sort of imagined version of a knight templar or hospitaller, this idea of a knight who kind of upholds both all of these monastic virtues and is also a great warrior against the infidels and all that sort of stuff. And that's really not accurate to what the man himself was like, but it is a very powerful image that comes to be attached to El Cid over the course of his afterlife. And that essentially leads into the last section of the book, which is largely about Spain in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the way that El Cid becomes a real significant icon for Franco's regime, the setting off of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, and then the control of Spain by this fascist dictatorship, and the way that they become very attached to this image of El Cid as the barbarian destroyer, as the savior of Spain, as this um, you know image of the original Reconquista, that they're fighting the modern Reconquista. It's sort of one of the um, narratives that is bandied about, and the kind of complicated way that that is a sort of idea that is both something that comes from kind of the top down from this dictatorial government, but also is something that comes out of like intellectual engagement with the idea of El Cid, and the kind of nature of the way that sort of the political and the academic, and all of these different kind of elements come together in difficult to anticipate ways, um, including the way that El Cid is reinterpreted in the modern world after the end of the dictatorship, the Franco dictatorship, um, into something that is sort of both the original life of El Cid and this later life of El Cid, and kind of wrestling with the question of how to think about this figure who has had this long legendary history, a longer legendary history than his actual kind of life history in many ways. Um, a little bit like, I mean, I'm a big fan of King Arthur stories, as you can probably tell based on, I guess, if you know about King Pellam, you know about the reference that is in my channel's name. But broadly, kind of similar to the concept of historical King Arthur, except that historical Cid has like good evidence about him, and historical Arthur doesn't really, unfortunately. But this idea of kind of the way that the legend has grown over time, and thinking about how we should think about this figure. And there's some interesting stuff in there. I don't totally agree with. I think the conclusion of the this whole narrative, basically the author Nora Berend comes down with the position that El Cid is kind of an interesting historical figure, but he is not a good person, and that valorizing him, even in attempt to kind of recontextualize him for the modern world and think about him as a sort of valorized symbol of this kind of multicultural, kind of cross-cultural interaction, and this idea of a person who is like trying to survive in a difficult world and all that sort of stuff, is fundamentally flawed, because it is based on transforming a man who is like tremendously violent in life. Like his claim to fame in life basically is that he's really good at fighting and winning battles. And the idea that that is fundamentally not compatible with a what we should want heroes to be like in the modern world. And I don't totally agree with that. I think there is a strong argument for the validity of that position, but I also think it sort of ignores, I guess, for lack of a better term, the treatment of the heroic as an aesthetic position and not a ethical one. And I think that that is what interests me, basically. I kind of, and to bring it back to King Arthur, it's kind of like the whole thing with, yeah, King Arthur, a lot of these stories include him doing really horrible things. The whole May Babies story is really, really grim and evil, and something that nobody ought to do in real life or probably even in mythologies, but what kind of makes his character as this legendary figure compelling is partly built on these things. And I think that's sort of where I end up. There's a sort of question of, can a character be um, compelling and worth studying without being valorized, that this book doesn't really weigh in on as much. And it seems to me that that's the sort of appropriate place for a figure like Rodrigo Diaz in his afterlife, is to remain compelling and fascinating and worth studying without being valorized in a way that suggests that everything that he did in life was good, or that we should try to live the way he lived in the 11th century as a model for ourselves in the 21st. Um, which is to say that I think the book was quite good, but I don't totally agree with the conclusions at the end. But I think that has more to do with my own assumptions about kind of what engagement with history ought to be like. And especially there's an issue of sort of the academic engagement with history and how that transforms into something non-academic when it sort of passes beyond the borders of academia. And I think that there's a concern about sort of the unintended consequences of a particular flavor of fascination with this particular myth that is based off of the history of like the 30s and 40s and 50s in Spain. Um, so anyway, I guess all that's to say, I think you should read this book because it's pretty good. Pretty, it's not super long. Like I said, excuse me, my digital copy was like 300 pages long, and that includes a bunch of notes and stuff. So you can totally read this pretty quickly, and it is definitely like fun and interesting. There's a lot of really interesting stuff on display here, and think about it yourself as to how you think we ought to think about medieval warlords turned into saints and super soldiers and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, that is going to be it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you've read El Cid, The Life and Afterlife of a Medieval Mercenary by Nora Berend, let me know in the comments. If you read other stuff that you think is similar and I or someone else might be interested in, if they're interested in this book, let me know as well. Or yeah, if you just have something else you want to talk about, feel free to leave a comment below. Otherwise, I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.